A good morning or good evening to everyone out there listening to this podcast, wherever you may find yourself around the world. I have another exciting topic to cover today. It is referring to the implications of tax residency and inheritance. So this is not a very often talked about topic, but incredibly important consequences and implications for expats to be aware of. So I do have with me here today Mbalenhle, a tax consultant here, a tax expatriate specialist at Tax Consulting South Africa, who specializes in financial immigration and the implications of tax residency on various transactions from South Africa. So good to be here with you today, Mbali.
Thank you, John-Paul, and thank you to everyone listening in.
Perfect. I know, Mbali, you are raring to go and get into this topic. I know you are quite passionate about this topic. And if I'm correct, you've just released an article which is on our website that viewers, listeners can go and have a look at.
Correct. Yeah. So we do have an article on our website, financial immigration website, which speaks on inheritance. So how can expatriates who have seized a tax residency remit or get a hand in their inheritance in South Africa? So it does expand on what is required, the process of obtaining it, as well as the tax implications.
Perfect. So I think at this stage, let's delve right into it.
Yeah.
I'm going to be asking you a few questions, some of them very important ones for clarity's sake for those hopefully listening as well. And essentially the first one, I think, is probably the most important one, and that is what proof is needed to confirm that you are indeed a non-tax resident when you are looking to get out inheritance?
Perfect. That's a lovely question. So a lot of people don't know. We have a lot of people who have lived and moved abroad for a number of years, and they find themselves in a position where they have an inheritance in South Africa and they actually don't know how to get a hold of it, simply because they haven't seized a tax residency. They've never heard of that concept, and some don't even have a tax number. So the first point for those who still have tax numbers in South Africa, the most important thing is to seize your tax residency formally. Now, this is done through SARS, where you apply to SARS to notify them and let them know that you don't intend on being ordinarily resident in South Africa. So therefore, you'd like to seize your tax residence and become a non-resident. And then as supporting evidence of that, you need to obtain a notice of non-resident confirmation letter.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Mbali. And the next pertinent point, I think, before we delve into the building blocks of what we're going to be discussing here is, can you explain exactly what the Approval International Transfer of Funds PIN is?
Sure. Okay, so when one seizes their tax residency, it is quite a process. It goes into segments. So the first segment would be to obviously obtain that proof that you have seized your tax residency by getting that notice of non-resident confirmation letter. Now we move to the AIT. Now what AIT stands for is Approval International Transfer PIN. And basically this is a clearance PIN that allows you to move funds. Now, I know a lot of clients they will ask, do I need an AIT to move on my inheritance? So the answer to that is that luckily with inheritance, you don't need an AIT. But for any inheritance that is above 10 million, you'll need to get that clearance from SARB.
That's a very interesting, Mbali, and thanks for clarifying that. I know there's a lot of misconception about getting ARTs for inheritance, and the common misconception being that you do indeed need to get it. So thank you for clarifying that. We're already onto some golden tips for those listeners that are interested in this topic. In terms of now that we've covered how to get your inheritance, well, from a documentary evidence point of view, at least as a non-tax resident, and what the process is called to get it out of South Africa, in terms of steps to be taken for those South African expatriates abroad who need to ensure tax compliance, what steps would you advise them to take as a starting point, just to ensure, again, I mean, going through the inheritance, you've just lost a loved one, presumably, to make things a lot simpler and not overcomplicate things when you do need it the most,
100%. So the first thing is to ensure compliance. So what compliance means or looks like is making sure that you don't have any outstanding tax returns. If there is any tax liabilities, making sure that you settle those with SARS, because SARS is very finicky, in respect of just granting you a non-residency status. They want to make sure that you've tied all ties in terms of tax liabilities. So that's the first step. And then obviously then you move to the application of your non-residency confirmation letter. Now, one thing I also do want to touch on, those people, clients that have, previously left and deactivated their tax numbers, very important that they will need to actually reactivate their tax number before they can actually get a hand into the inheritance. So once you reactivate your tax number, then you go and proceed with actually seizing a tax residency, because once you reactivate, you can't reactivate as a non-resident, rather as a tax resident. Then you can go through the process of seizing your tax residency and obtaining that notice of non-resident confirmation letter.
Perfect. Thanks, Mbalenhle. Again, such clarity there. Interestingly to note for listeners that when you do reactivate, you have to reactivate as a tax resident.
Correct.
It's very interesting. Obviously, you've got broad consequences and implications. So thanks for that, Mbalenhle. And in terms of just what the importance is really, I know the executor might need it when they're talking about giving you the benefit of the inheritance. But if you had to come down to the crux of why it's important for those expatriates from South Africa to establish their non-tax residency status.
I mean, to seize your tax residency, it's more than just looking at encashing of that inheritance. You just want to also make sure that you protect yourself from a taxing perspective, because as a non-resident, you're only taxable on South African sourced. So if you don't seize your tax residency, you potentially open yourself to that double taxation, meaning you'd pay tax in the jurisdiction that you're domiciled in, as well as South Africa. So it's very important to establish that when you seize your tax residency, it's not only for one purpose, which is remitting of that inheritance, but rather protecting your foreign income as well as assets that are abroad.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Mbalenhle. So I think there is a trend, obviously we're going to be doing a few podcasts on the implications of residency for those expats abroad. But what keeps coming to the forefront of the discussion is that ceasing your tax residency formally has got numerous benefits.
Yes.
Obviously, there are certain times you have to do so, as such in this case with inheritance. But that's just important to note. In terms of the requirement now, we've spoken about ensuring you're tax compliant, spoken about getting your non-res letter to provide that to the estate executor. But now the important question, because the money is still not in my account, you know, how exactly do I go about getting those funds from South Africa to wherever I'm sitting around the world?
Okay, so luckily with inheritance, it's not treated the same way as retirement annuities. So you don't have to have a South African bank account. So that's the great news. So you can actually communicate with executors dealing with the estate to then transfer the inheritance to an offshore bank account. So that's the nice thing about it. You don't have to wonder about, do I have to have a South African bank account? You can have it directly, sent to an offshore bank account. Also important to note, you must declare of this inheritance. So yes, it's not taxable in the hands of the beneficiary. The estate duty will take care of that, but it's very important that both for tax residents and non-residents to declare of that inheritance on their return.
Perfect. Thanks, Mbalenhle. And maybe not to backtrack a little bit, but for those, obviously, the expats who have not ceased their tax residency, how does this approval international transfer of funds apply to them? Is that required as well in terms of just transfers out of South Africa? Maybe it won't be relevant to the inheritance because you might not need an ART for that, from what I've understood here. But in terms of the rights that a South African tax resident has when transferring funds abroad, maybe you could just elaborate on that for us.
Okay, so in terms of any funds other than inheritance, you will need to get an approval international transfer PIN. So as a tax resident, the AIT is afforded to you for any transfers above 1 million rand. But in terms of inheritance, you don't need to get that AIT.
And in terms of it does. I'm going to have a follow-up question here in terms of that 1 million rand you just spoke of now. Can you elaborate on what that means for tax residents and how that applies? Okay,
so every South African tax resident does have the advantage of having a single discretionary allowance, which is afforded to you in a calendar year. So you have the ability of actually moving funds up to 1 million without actually getting a tax clearance. But any fund that would be above or exceed that 1 million, you will have to get that AIT. So it is afforded to all South Africans. If you are a tax resident, you have that green ID book or that smart card, you are afforded that.
Okay. And then in terms of, I know a lot of clients that we deal with, some of them are a bit hesitant or nervous, let alone to now, maybe they haven't ceased tax residency for a long time, but they've been abroad, but also approving or applying for the approval of international transfer. I know there's a lot of hesitancy about SARS looking into their financials and affairs. What are the kind of implications? Should that be a deterrent when applying for an ART PIN? Is that a truth or is that really relevant? I don't know if you maybe shed some light on that for those listeners interested in that aspect.
Yeah, so I mean, it is quite daunting for a lot of clients. They are a bit scared that it might wake sleeping dogs, because the process in actually declaring, what you have and what you're trying to move, they do ask quite a lot. So they do want to know the source of funds, where the funds coming from and where they are going to. So there can be a little bit of exposure that you'd have to declare to SARS in terms of funds. They want to ensure that when you're applying for this AIT, the funds that you're trying to remit, can you actually afford? So that would then lead into you providing statements, to show that you can actually move the funds that you are trying to move abroad.
I see. Okay. Thanks for that, Mbalenhle. And in terms of the actual tax side or tax implications of an inheritance, maybe you could just explain to us, we've obviously covered it's a requirement to provide your confirmation of non-tax residency. But now, once we've done that, how do the tax implications work on an inheritance that let's say I'm getting?
Yeah. So luckily, as mentioned earlier, in terms of taxing implications, you are not taxed as the beneficiary. So the estate will handle that. So once the estate has been winded, obviously there is a concept called estate duty. That's when the tax will then be handled. So in the hands of the beneficiary, there isn't any tax that you'd have to pay.
Okay, that's very helpful to know.
Yeah.
I know specifically those South Africans abroad definitely do not want to pay tax to SARS, so that's at least it won't be taxed in their hands. And in terms of documentation, for those expats abroad who have not formalized their financial immigration, what exactly can they expect to be required from them? I mean, obviously, we've just advised that you should embark on the process. So, I mean, what does that mean to those expats abroad? What kind of documentary evidence is going to be required for this process?
Sure. So one needs to definitely mention or state the intention. So this process, when one sees their tax residency, it's very much an intention-based process. So you must declare to SARS that, by way of a cover letter or motivation letter, that you intend on remaining abroad permanently. And then in terms of the supporting documents, there are objective factors that are considered. So you'd have to actually provide proof that you are a taxpayer abroad. So a tax residency certificate in this case would then be taken into account. You'd have to prove that you are domiciled there. So an address, you'd have to produce other certain documentation, which we do, engage on once we deal with you as a client.
Awesome. So essentially, you assist with this. There's no
Correct.
deterrent. It is required.
Yes.
So I think if those listeners who haven't caught the hint by now, definitely to embark on formalizing their non-tax residency in South Africa. From what I'm hearing, there's actually no downside to it.
Yes.
It's definitely not the right approach to be avoiding it either. I think sleep is very important at night, and I know that a lot of our clients who do approach us in the end are having sleepless nights. So I would encourage those listeners who haven't done this to definitely embark on the process. But next question from my side, in terms of exchange control, I know this is a very, very dark or mystical area for some listeners. What does exchange control essentially mean? How does it work? Maybe you could just elaborate on this topic for us in terms of what exchange control requirements may be implicated on transfers abroad by non-residents.
Okay, so it's not that daunting. Just to circle back, it's basically obtaining of clearance. So before any funds can move abroad, they must be cleared. So like I said, with inheritance, there isn't much requirements for any inheritance that are below 10 million, there's no clearance. It can be just transferred abroad without obtaining any clearance. But for any transfers that are above 10 million, very, very important to get that clearance from a SARS perspective.
Thanks, Mbalenhle. And in terms of timing of this process.
Yes.
So we have alluded to the fact that those who have not formalized their non-tax residency status, that it's not too late. So
100%.
That's not too late. Okay, thanks for confirming that. And then just in terms of maybe timing of inheritance, I've noticed from my side that I hop into a lot of consultations with clients who are actually approaching me to get an inheritance out, but they haven't actually done the point A, which is formalize their non-tax residency. So in terms of timing, is there a specific time to embark on this process, or is sooner the better?
I mean, it's obviously the sooner the better. Like I said, the purpose of seizing a tax residency is not just aimed at one thing. You want to make sure that you also look at other things holistically. So your protection of your foreign income. So there's no exact timing, but for as long as you know your intention is not to come back, irrespective of when inheritance is coming in, it would be better to do it as soon as possible, just to make sure that you are in the clear with SARS, you are compliant, you know that your foreign income as well as assets are protected. And in the event that you do receive an inheritance, it's sort of like a seamless process.
I see. Makes perfect sense to me. At this stage, I think you've provided us with a lot of clarity on the topic. I know, like I said at the outset, it's not a very talked about topic, but
100%.
very sensitive one that should be covered and expats should be aware of, I think just in terms of talking about the two-part retirement system, which we did previously, and the ongoing topics we are going to be talking about, just definitely the trend of formalizing your non-tax residency status is always the starting point.
100%.
So I think if there's any closing comments or summary from your side in terms of this golden nuggets you have for our listeners.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think it's very important that I know a lot of people just leave and think when I leave or renounce of my South African citizenship, it kind of closes the taxing part of it. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So very, very important that you attend to that because the two are dealt with separately. So make sure that your affairs are handled rather from a home affairs perspective as well as a taxing perspective to ensure that you are compliant and you are on the right side of the law.
Perfect and very prudent advice. Thank you for that, Mbalenhle. And I will put it out there that obviously you assist in all of these aspects here at Tax Consulting South Africa. So for those listeners interested, we are on Facebook, we are on LinkedIn, we are on
Instagram,
Google, everywhere you can find us. And I'm sure you would be very, very happy to have some consults with the listeners who are interested. So please do feel free to reach out to us. And we hope that this session provided some clarity. Indeed. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.